Today, Sakhisizwe is addressing the topic of gender-based violence and women's representation in history. The stories we learn about South African activism are far too often told from male-focused lens. This narrative of history ignores the crucial roles of the women on the front lines of the fight for gender equality. Without their contributions, human rights in South Africa would be drastically altered. Sakhisizwe is honored to speak with MOSAIC program director Ronel Stevens about the launch of HerStory, a groundbreaking feminist podcast that amplifies the stories of women activists at the forefront of the fight against gender-based violence. How are you doing today, Ronel?
I'm doing great, thank you.
That's great. We're so excited to speak with you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate the time.
Good afternoon, Ronel. So you have Jasmine and Nadia on the line with you. So Ronel, if you can just if you can just tell us a little bit more about the inspiration behind creating HerStory Podcast.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jasmine. It is so great to be connected with you again. I remember the time you came to the MOSAIC office.
Definitely.
So happy to have you in our company again. The creation of HerStory actually happened in 2020 when we were all in shutdown, and the only way we could really deeply connect was through online opportunities, right? And so the HerStory podcast really was looking for how can you access information about activists, particularly women activists, who have been so fundamental in South Africa's history of women activists. How do you find them? And we realized they're not online, so we don't have an archive, and that was really where it all started for us. We wanted to be able to create this archive that it was inspired by recognizing these women who are generally overlooked in South Africa's history of activism. And also we wanted to ensure that there is a platform where it's audio, it's visual, it's written, and there will be many different ways that people are able to engage the story, even beyond just the podcast.
Definitely. And so often it's so hard for someone to actually speak about the trauma that has occurred in their lives, especially whether we look at gender-based violence or if we just going to look back at apartheid years and so forth. So what led you to focusing on the activism side of gender-based violence? Why did you feel
Absolutely.
You want to bring in people or women that activists basically to tell their story and not just some ordinary woman maybe on the Cape Flats or so forth?
The reality is that these women activists are from the Cape Flats. So they are regular women. They are women who are part of movements. They are women who are just regular neighbors, aunties, around the way people. But we wanted to have an opportunity where these voices and the efforts of these grassroots women or grassroots organizing women were actually lifted in these kind of spaces, because the same way that you shared, it's so important that we don't just have survivors tell their stories over and over, because it is quite traumatizing. So if you are able to say, let's hear from a different lens, from a different perspective, but still linked and rooted into communities, are we able then to lift those spaces and those voices? And so that really was the goal. It's like to make sure that it's still relevant, it's still rooted in communities, but it is the voices of the activists who are being platformed.
And so what are some common challenges that are faced by women activists when combating gender-based violence, and how does HerStory shed light on these challenges?
Nadia, I have to ask you to repeat the question because I struggled to hear.
Of course, no problem. So, what are some of the common challenges faced by women activists when combating gender-based violence, and how does HerStory shed light on these challenges? Did you get that?
Yeah, I did. Thank
Wonderful.
you so much. Certainly. I mean, the face of survivors has really changed, and it's not just during the pandemic, but particularly also through the pandemic. When we talk about women activists, we're also speaking about other activists who are fighting for and bringing challenges to gender-based violence as a general kind of activist. And for us, the challenges that we've actually seen include like the harmful gender norms and attitudes that really perpetuate gender inequality and violence in these communities. The lack of resources to be able to really do the work, and particularly at a grassroots level. and support for these grassroots initiatives. We really felt like being able to bring up these stories will hear a little more about how people actually thought about organizing. What are some of these barriers? Are these barriers just governmental? Is it just at a law enforcement level? Or is it actually at like a societal level? And let's be able to kind of discuss those. And for us, it was a combination of both, but also particularly looking at harmful gender norms and how that has a huge impact for the women activists to really navigate these intersectional conversations.
And you still tune into Sakhisizwe Building the Nation Bodinasi. We are speaking to Ronel Stevens from MOSAIC, and she's just been telling us a little bit more about the podcast called Her Story. So do engage with us, 061-862-1065. Ronel, and it's not very easy, or it's not always easy to have a conversation when it comes to the age barriers. So how does Her Story facilitate this connection between older and younger generations of activism?
I think there is such a lot of value in being able to create platforms where all generations, all kind of intersectoral conversations could happen at the same time.
Agreed.
But I don't think that there are many platforms that really facilitate that. And so with Her Story, we were very particular about what would be our kind of first season guest and how we're going to be developing this concept into a second season, into a third season and beyond. And that really is where the intersectoral conversation is starting. So we're looking at what were the struggles, the challenges, the barriers that, our older activists had to experience. Is there anything that we can learn from this? And then in the second season, we are hoping to have a lot more the younger generation kind of speak up and hear their voices in the conversation, and then to kind of make the conversation even more intersectoral by looking at, if the fate of survivors had changed, who else do we draw into this conversation around gender-based violence and the fight that we are currently having in South Africa with it.
And it's so inspiring when you talk about the ways that, or the importance of having these intergenerational conversations, because I also think that, the stories of elders really inspire young people into action. So what ways do you hope that HerStory Podcast will inspire collective action towards ending violence against women in the 21st century?
That's a great question. Thank you so much, Nadia. Our story aims really to amplify the voices of all activists in the sector, and we really just hope that it's a platform where people can inspire using their stories and experiences and insights, and particularly starting to have this, intersectoral and intergenerational conversation that doesn't feel like they are at odds with one another. But by really highlighting the work of, women and other vulnerable people who are caregivers, who are grassroots organizers and leaders, in the fight against gender-based violence. And the podcast really looks to draw attention to how crucial of a role they play, both in the past, in the present, and in the future. I am the mother of a 11-year-old, and I'm seeking that level of gender equality for my daughter. I hope that she gets to experience it in her lifetime. And so there's really great insight that we can gain from those who have done it before us. But there's also a lot that I know that my daughter and the generations that's still to come would be able to kind of add to our dialogue and our storytelling. And so really it's about bringing those connections together. And that's what we hope to do with the HerStory podcast.
Definitely, and that is actually very impressive that you are doing, or great work that you are doing. And then, Ronel, I also want to know, so ever since the podcast has been launched, what have the feedback been like? Because this is actually something that, or a platform where women can hear women's stories and also have the courage to speak out and seek the help that they basically need in order to work through that trauma, in order to move through the healing process. So what has the feedback been like?
Okay, I have to share with you that we haven't launched yet. We did a soft launch on the first episode, but that was also linked to our 30th year celebration. So the first episode was, of course, greeted with a lot of just gratitude, But again, it was launched to people who are in the sector who are already having these conversations. And what we're hoping with the kind of trailer launch that we're doing at the end of the month is really to actually have an opportunity to talk about how can we drive that level of conversation that you're asking about. So that it's not just people who are in the sector and you're not preaching to the choir, but you're getting a different kind of audience to be part of this conversation. And so really it is thinking about the conversation is not just meant to stay kind of in suburbia. How do we take it to rural communities? How are we thinking about how this could impact not just South Africa, but the rest of the continent? How are we creating space for survivors to share their stories by listening to other activists? And so I'm really inspired to hope and to think that, the HerStory podcast could be able to offer a platform like that and to have that level of engagement. But yeah, we haven't launched yet. So fingers crossed and, all praise for that kind of receipt of the podcast.
Mm-hmm. And so you've mentioned intersectionality, over the duration of this interview a few times, but can you elaborate on the specific ways that HerStory incorporates intersectionality into its discussions on gender-based violence?
Yeah, I think it's so important. I mean, one of the first things that I wanted to point out is that the focus is not just on women activists. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the season one had started, because we needed kind of like a launch pad. But the conversation really for us is to think about if we are having a conversation about survivors, if we're having a conversation about how activists is actually creating spaces and platforms for survivors to take up services to be able to action and activate their rights, how are we going to be actually able to do this if our conversation remains on a podcast? If we are not taking it to radio, like in the way that you are doing the interview with me now, or why don't we take it to newspapers, or why are we not having these conversations in towns with corporations and not just in townships? Because I think a key thing for us at MOSAIC, and particularly through the HerStory podcast, it is about being able to do narrative shifts. All of the interventions, where they're directed, Black men who are unemployed, who are in townships, we're really trying to say that all of us should be aware of gender-based violence. All of us should be able to know what our rights are and how to be able to access these rights and how to activate these rights as well. And then we also need to be able to say when things are not okay. We need to be able to find the words to stand up and to find a way to be the everyday activists ourselves. And so the intersectoral conversation I'm trying to have is really one of a narrative shift. So does the conversation just remain here in the GBV sector, or can we take it beyond? And that's really what the HerStory podcast is aiming to do.
Thank you very much, Ronel, for taking the time to speak to us today. And also earlier you touched on that you've only, it's only people that work within the sector that you have exposed the podcast to. So if you can maybe just elaborate a little bit more on the strategies and the lessons learned that have emerged from the story shared in her story, and also how they contribute to the ongoing struggle for justice and inequality, so that you are able to take it back to the community, so that the community can basically benefit out of her story.
Absolutely. I think a key thing for us is when we speak to one another in the sector, we need to also recognize that we have a dual responsibility, that it's not just MOSAIC's role, that it's not just the Colours Foundation or SAFI or any of the people that we had actually told on through the podcast. Collectively, this is how we're going to be able to break down that gender inequality in the relationships, in homes and in communities. So it really is about being able to kind of break down those barriers, create a platform that is neutral, but a platform that is quite deliberate and intentional. And then being able to say, okay, now we have this platform, how are we then able to make sure that we kind of look at what these challenges and barriers are for activists, try to address it as a collective, and then also look at different ways in which we are able to break down what presents barriers, whether structurally, whether systemically, or beyond. So it is really about creating that platform where the discussion can start happening, and then it's not just like, in the same circles, like I mentioned, not just saying or singing to the choir, but it's being able to take it beyond our sector and beyond just the regular conversations that we would have on a day-to-day basis.
Mm. And I'm really curious also to know how does HerStory Podcast navigate the complexities of cultural norms and traditions that may perpetuate gender inequalities in South Africa?
I mean, that is a really big question and something that we are so, I guess, in some senses toying with, especially when you think about kind of deeper understanding of what activists are experiencing. Mm-hmm. I think that those themes kind of organically and naturally have come to the rise in our conversation. Mm-hmm. It's not something that we have particularly set out that, we need to talk about harmful gender norms. But as people are processing and they are reflecting through what are some of the challenges that they are still, up until this day, since 1976, what are they still facing? Some of the kind of harmful gender norms, societal attitudes still come to the fore. And so I think that in a sense, it's about being able to be transparent and to lift these conversations so that they don't become privatized and they don't become issues that we can deal with on our own as individuals in our relationships and homes, but that we really address these issues as a collective. And I think part of that conversation, particularly focusing around activists and how they've been able to do it, it really is an opportunity to kind of get some key tips on how to be able to take it beyond just the individual and to collectively be able to have solidarity for one another and to think about how sisterhood could also help us move beyond our current state of gender inequality.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Ronel, for taking the time to speak to us today. So just lastly, how can individuals and organizations support HerStory Podcast and also contribute to its mission of amplifying the voices of the women activists, as well as what message would you like to convey to our listeners as they join you in celebrating the launch of HerStory?
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I mean, there's so many different ways. I think for now to just follow at MOSAIC NGO on Instagram, on Facebook. We are also on LinkedIn and on Twitter, on X. We will be kind of sharing more information about the podcast and where people are able to listen from. But I think what could be really vital for us is also for people to share. I would love for you to interview so-and-so. Just has been quite fundamental in my understanding of gender equality and how to actually kind of process my story and my experiences. And so what we really hope that the listeners are able to take away from the HerStory podcast and what they're able to support us with is to be part of the community. Share, talk about, engage, constructively give us some feedback. But we really hope that the listeners will be able to take away a deeper understanding of what South African feminist HerStory really is looking like, or what it looked like, what it looks like now, and what it could potentially look like in the future, but also the vital role that activists continue to play in the struggle against gender-based violence in South Africa. I think by sharing stories and perspectives of these diverse activists across generations, our podcast really is trying to inspire solidarity and collective action. And so for me, it really is about how to be part of this is to really just kind of put your hand up and be part of the community. So, my encouragement again is to love, share, talk about, have it on your WhatsApp status about the HerStory podcast. And we hope to share some information with Bush Radio that they're also able to share on their social media platforms on behalf of MOSAIC.
Definitely amazing stuff. Thank you very much, Ronel, for taking the time to speak to us today and getting more people on board to support HerStory and also actually listen to the podcast. Like you said, just comes down to liking, sharing, and just spreading the broader message across. So have a good day further.
Yes,
bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
And that was Ronel Stevens, and she is from MOSAIC, and she was just speaking to us a little bit more about HerStory Podcast. And so the best way to get all the information, to be a part of that, to be a part of the change and also raise your voices, is to simply go via MOSAIC's website, and that is where you will find the podcast. So right now, taking us to the isiXhosa news at 1 o'clock with Isobusi is the sounds by City Girls featuring Asa, called Good Love, coming your way.